Sundar Pichai's private jet breaks down in a remote village. What he does next leaves everyone stunned. Sky over the Indian countryside was painted with strokes of orange and pink as Sundar. Pichai's private jet sliced through the clouds. Inside, the quiet hum of engines was almost soothing. Sundar leaned back in his seat, going over his notes for an upcoming meeting. He had come to India for a rare few days to visit his childhood neighborhood, speak at a school, and meet some promising young engineers. But just as he glanced out the window, he felt something strange. A jolt, then a shudder. The lights flickered. He looked at the attendant, who froze in place, her smile vanishing. "Sir?" The pilot's voice crackled through the speaker. "We're experiencing a serious mechanical problem. We need to make an emergency landing immediately." Sundar's fingers gripped the armrest. His mind, trained for solving complex problems, began working through possibilities. "Where are we landing?" he asked, calm but alert. The answer came back. "A field near a small village. It's the only option." The engines whined louder, then sputtered. Sundar felt his heart race as the jet dipped, and the sight outside the window changed. Now a patchwork of fields and a cluster of tiny houses. The attendant buckled herself in and motioned for Sundar to do the same, with a final roar and a violent tremor. The jet hit the ground with a lurch, wheels digging into the dirt, sending up a huge spray of dust. It skidded to a stop just outside a cluster of huts. For a long moment, all was silent except for the faint ticking of the cooling engines. Then Sundar exhaled, unbuckled himself, and stood, checking on the others. They were shaken but unharmed. "We need to get help," the pilot said quietly, his eyes darting toward the village. "I'll go," Sundar replied simply. He stepped down the stairs of the jet, feeling the warm earth under his polished shoes. The air smelled of smoke, wet soil, and faint spices. A few children stood at the edge of the field, eyes wide with fear and curiosity. He raised a hand gently, and the tallest boy stepped forward. Sundar smiled softly. "Namaste," he said, his voice warm. "Our plane broke down. Can you help?" "US?" The boy blinked and nodded quickly before running back toward the houses. Sundar followed, feeling the weight of eyes on him as more villagers came out. Men in worn shirts, women in bright saris, barefoot children clutching each other's hands. An older man, bent but dignified, stepped up. "What happened?" he asked in a quiet voice. "Our jet is broken," Sundar explained. "We need help." "Perhaps a mechanic or someone who knows where to get parts?" The man's eyes widened slightly. "There is no mechanic here," he said. "But you are welcome. Come." And so Sundar found himself walking through the dusty lanes of the village, his expensive suit now spotted with dust, his leather shoes sinking into soft mud. People whispered his name. Some recognized him from newspapers, others just stared. At the stranger who had fallen from the sky, they brought him to a shaded courtyard, where a clay pitcher of water was placed before him. The old man introduced himself as Haram and invited Sundar to sit. "We have no phones here," Haram said. "No network. No electricity, except for a generator that runs only 2 hours a day. But we can send someone on a bicycle to the town tomorrow to call for help." Sundar nodded gratefully. "Thank you," he said, meaning a but as the sun set, a problem arose. The pilot returned, looking worried. "Sir, we checked the jet. One of the fuel lines is ruptured, and the part we need is very specific. It might take days to bring it." "Here." Sundar fell silent. He looked around at the thin children playing with sticks, the women cooking over open fires, the cracked walls of the houses. Here he was, a man at the head of one of the largest companies in the world, stranded, in a place that had nothing of the modern world he worked to build. He stood up, walked out into the village square, and sat on the edge of a stone well. As he sat there, the little boy from before, his name was Arjun, came and handed him a small chapati wrapped in a cloth. "You didn't eat," Arjun said shyly. Sundar smiled and took it. "Thank you, Arjun," he said. "What do you want to be when you grow up?" The boy tilted his head. "I want to fix big machines," he said. But we have no school here for that. The words struck Sundar like a thunderclap. Here was a boy who dreamed of fixing machines. The very thing Sundar himself once dreamed of. Later that night. As he lay in a simple cot under a thatched roof, the stars brilliant above, he couldn't sleep. His mind turned over and over on the words Arjun had said. The next morning, Sundar woke early to the sound of roosters and walked out to watch the sunrise. The villagers were already busy, women carrying water, men leading cattle, children sweeping the dusty lanes. The pilot approached. Sir, he said, we managed to get through to the company. They can send another jet in 2 days to pick you up. Sundar nodded slowly, still watching the village wake to life. He turned to the pilot. Tell them not to hurry, he said. Sir? Tell them I'm staying here for now. The pilot blinked, but said nothing, sensing something in Sundar's voice that brooked no argument. That day, Sundar walked the village. He talked to the farmers, helped an old woman carry a bundle of sticks, sat with children and told them stories about the moon and stars. Everywhere he went, he saw things he had forgotten, the dignity and simplicity, the quiet strength in these people. But then came the first conflict. As Sundar sat under a tree, speaking to Arjun and his friends. A group of men approached, led by a younger man with sharp eyes and a sneer. Who is this man? The young leader demanded. Harim stepped forward. He is a guest, he said firmly. The young man scoffed. Guests bring trouble. Rich men come here, take pictures, make promises, and then leave. They never change anything. Why should we waste our time with him? Sundar stood slowly and looked the man in the eyes. You're right, Sundar said quietly. Rich men come and go. But maybe this time it can be different. The young man laughed bitterly and walked away. Sundar could feel the tension in the air, the weight of skepticism and bitterness. That night, Sundar sat alone by the well, staring into the dark water. The quiet of the village was pierced by the sound of distant drums. A wedding somewhere, or perhaps a festival. He thought of his own childhood, of growing up in Chennai, of sitting under a fan with a book and dreaming of building something that mattered. He thought of Arjun, and he decided. The next morning, he asked Harim to gather the villagers. When they stood before him, men, women, children, Sundar spoke in a steady voice. I came here by accident, he said. But now I see why I was meant to land here. I don't want to just leave you behind. I want to build something here. A school, a training center. So children like Arjun can learn to fix machines. So your sons and daughters can dream bigger. A murmur ran through the crowd. Some faces lit up with hope. Others frowned in suspicion. But, Sundar added, I can't do it alone. I need your help. If we work together, we can change this place. And then a quiet voice spoke up. It was the young man from before. He stepped forward, his eyes hard. Words are easy, he said. But if you really mean it, prove it. Stay here. Live like us. Show us you understand our life before you try to change it. The crowd fell silent, waiting for Sundar's answer. He looked at the young man, then at Harim, then at Arjun's hopeful face, and he said just one word. Yes. The young man smirked. Then tomorrow you come to the fields. You work with? Yes. You eat what we eat. No special treatment. Again, Sundar nodded. Yes. The crowd gasped softly, and Sundar felt the weight of what he had just agreed to. That night, as he lay under the stars, the air thick with the scent of earth and smoke, he wondered if he had made the right choice. The work ahead would be hard, harder than anything he had faced in a boardroom. And already in the shadows beyond the well, he sensed forces moving against him. Because in every village there are secrets. And Sundar was about to discover that some of those secrets would change everything. Just before he drifted into an uneasy sleep, he heard a faint sound, a whisper carried on the wind. You shouldn't have come here. And in that moment, Sundar realized his journey was only beginning. Asterisk, the morning air was cold and heavy when Sundar woke. Long before the sun rose, the stars were beginning to fade and the eastern sky glowed faintly with the promise of light. He lay still on the hard cot, staring at the thatched ceiling, thinking of the whisper he had heard in the dark. You shouldn't have come here. It had sounded like a warning, but from whom? And why? His first instinct was to dismiss it as a dream, a trick of a tired mind after a long and strange day. But something deep inside told him it was not just a dream. It felt heavier than that, like a shadow that had already begun to spread over him. He pushed himself up, feeling the stiffness in his back and shoulders. He wasn't used to sleeping on something so rough, nor to waking at this hour, outside. The village was quiet but not completely silent. He could hear the soft lowing of cows in their pens, the distant murmur of a woman already grinding grain, the faint rustle of wind in the dry trees. Sundar walked outside and stood by the well where he'd sat the night before. The stones of the well were cold beneath his hands. The water inside was still and black. He gazed into it for a moment and thought he saw something move down there. But when he blinked, it was gone. Just his reflection, he told himself. Asterisk. As the sky brightened, he noticed figures emerging from their homes. Men with sickles and baskets. Women balancing pots on their heads. Children still rubbing the sleep from their eyes. A few of them glanced at him with curiosity or suspicion. Most looked past him entirely, as if he were already part of the landscape. Then the young man from yesterday, the one with the hard eyes and mocking smile, came walking toward him. His name, Sundar had learned, was Ravi. He carried 2 long-handled hoes on his shoulder and stopped in front of Sundar, his expression unreadable. You said you'd work, Ravi said. Let's see if you can keep your word. Sundar nodded silently. Ravi handed him one of the hoes, the wood rough and splintered in his hands. It was heavier than he expected. He followed Ravi through narrow paths, past the huts and into the fields beyond the village. There, the land stretched flat and cracked, dotted with tufts of dry grass and patches of thirsty crops. Already a dozen men were at work, bending low, their muscles straining as they turned the hard earth. Ravi led him to a corner of the field and motioned for him to start. Sundar stared at the ground, then at the tool in his hands. He had spent his life solving problems, making decisions that affected millions, but he had never dug into the earth with his own hands. He took a breath, raised the hoe, and brought it down into the soil. The jolt went up his arms and into his shoulders. He did it again and again, his breath growing short, sweat gathering on his forehead, even though the sun had barely risen. His hands began to blister almost immediately, but he said nothing at first. The men watched him out of the corners of their eyes, some of them whispering to each other. Sundar pretended not to notice. He focused on the soil in front of him, breaking it, turning it, feeling the rough rhythm of the work enter his body. The air grew warmer, and the sun climbed higher, painting the fields gold. His shirt stuck to his back, his lungs burned, but he kept going. Once he stumbled and fell to one knee, and he heard someone chuckle. When he looked up, it was Ravi standing over him, his arms crossed. You can stop, Ravi said flatly. You've proven your point. But Sundar shook his head. Not yet, he whispered. And he got back up. The day wore on. He worked through the morning, his hands raw and his breath ragged. When the break finally came, he collapsed under the shade of a neem tree. One of the older men, seeing the blisters on his palms, handed him a piece of cloth to wrap them. Sundar accepted it gratefully, his chest heaving. The older man gave a small nod, the first hint of respect he had seen all day. But as he sat there, sipping from a clay cup of water, he noticed something strange. Across the field, near the edge where the crops gave way to dry scrubland, 2 figures stood watching him. They were too far away to see clearly, but they didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there like shadows. He squinted, but before he could say anything, Ravi called him back to work, and when he looked again, the figures were gone by the time they returned to the village. The sun was sinking and the sky was streaked with deep purple. Sundar's arms and legs felt like lead. He could barely lift the hoe anymore. The villagers gathered around as he walked back through the square. some of them watching him with a little more warmth now, others still skeptical. Arjun ran up to him and handed him a small bundle of food, rice wrapped in a leaf. Sundar smiled weakly and thanked him. Haram met him at the doorway of his hut. The old man's eyes swept over him, noting his torn shirt, his bleeding hands, his sunburned face. He gave a small grunt of approval. "You didn't quit," he said. "No," Sundar replied softly. That night he sat again by the well. The moon was full now, and the whole village was bathed in pale light. Somewhere far off, a dog barked. The whisper he'd heard the night before still haunted him. As he sat there, he heard footsteps. Ravi appeared out of the darkness, carrying a lantern. He set it down the stone edge of the well and crossed his arms. "You're serious about staying," Ravi said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Sundar said. Ravi studied him for a long time. Then, surprisingly, he sat down next to him. For a while, neither spoke. Finally, Ravi said, "This village, it's not just poor. It's cursed." Sundar turned his head slowly. "Cursed?" Ravi's eyes stayed on the well water, dark and still. "Things happen here. Bad things. People disappear. Crops fail when they should thrive. And outsiders who try to help, they never stay long." He glanced at Sundar then, his gaze hard but not mocking anymore. "Someone doesn't want this place to change." Sundar frowned. "Who?" Ravi shook his head. "You'll see." Before Sundar could say more, a sudden sound split the night. A high, keening wail from somewhere in the fields. It didn't sound quite human. Sundar felt the hair rise on his neck. Ravi stood immediately, snatched up the lantern, and muttered, "Stay here." But Sundar rose too. "I'm coming with." "You?" Ravi gave him a sharp look but didn't argue. They walked quickly through the narrow lanes, past silent huts, into the open fields. The sound came again, closer now, and unmistakably anguished. They followed it to the edge of the scrubland where Sundar had seen the figures earlier that day. There, under the moonlight, they found a man on his knees, clutching his chest. Gasping for air, Ravi dropped to his side. "Uncle, what happened?" The man, an elder Sundar hadn't met yet, opened his mouth, but only a faint whisper came out. "The well, don't dig." Then his eyes rolled back and he collapsed. Ravi and Sundar carried him back to the village where Haram and a few others gathered around. They laid him down on a mat, and a woman began fanning him desperately. Sundar stood to the side, feeling helpless, feeling the weight of something dark pressing down on the room. When Haram finally looked up at him, his face was grave. "You should leave," the old man said quietly. Sundar shook his head. "Not yet." Haram stared at him for a long moment, then simply turned back to the sick man outside. The moon had disappeared behind clouds. Sundar walked back to the well, unable to shake the words the old man in the field had whispered. "The well, don't dig." He knelt by the edge, peered into the water. In the darkness, he thought he saw something at the bottom, something that glimmered faintly, like a shard of light buried in the blackness. Then a voice, low, close to his ear, hissed behind him. "Go back to your world before it's too late." Sundar spun around, but there was no one there. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of smoke and something metallic. And from somewhere beyond the fields, he heard that eerie wail again. This time, it sounded closer and more human. He stayed there for a long time, staring into the well as the clouds thickened and the first drops of rain began to fall. He felt the storm coming, not just in the sky, but here, in this place, in himself. And in that moment, he understood. He hadn't just stumbled into a village. He had stumbled into a story far older and darker than he could imagine. Came fast and hard that night, slamming down on the thatched roofs, turning the dusty lanes into rivers of mud. Sundar lay awake on his cot, staring into the dark as water dripped from the edges of the hut. Outside, thunder rolled low and long, shaking the earth, and the wind howled through the narrow spaces between the huts like a voice crying out. He kept thinking about the whisper he'd heard by the well, "Go back to your world before it's too late." and the old man's broken warning. The well, don't dig. But what was in the well? What was hidden beneath this quiet, crumbling village? He could not sleep as the storm raged. He rose quietly and stepped outside. The rain soaked him instantly, cold and heavy, plastering his shirt to his skin. The mud squelched beneath his feet, but he walked toward the well anyway, drawn to it like a moth to flame. In the distance, he could see the faint glow of lanterns where the villagers had gathered in one of the larger huts, no doubt waiting out the storm together. But here in the square, he was alone, and the only light came from jagged bursts of lightning that tore across the sky. He stopped at the well's edge. The stones were slick, the air colder here somehow. He peered down. The water below was restless, shimmering in the occasional flash of light from above. But then, just for a moment, he thought he saw something move beneath the surface. He leaned closer, gripping the edge of the stones. The wind howled louder, and then a hand shot up from the darkness below. It was pale and thin, his fingers impossibly long, reaching out of the water and scraping against the stone. Sundar stumbled back in shock, his heart hammering in his chest. But when he blinked, the hand was gone. Only the water remained, rippling softly as though nothing had happened. He backed away slowly, unable to tear his eyes from the well. He was about to turn when he noticed something lying on the ground at the base of the stones, a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth, half buried in the mud. Crouching down, he picked it up and unwrapped it carefully. Inside was an old photograph. Black and white, the edges curled and frayed. In the photo were 3 people, a young boy standing between 2 men. The boy's eyes were dark and serious, and behind them was the unmistakable shape of the same well. Scrawled in faded ink on the back of the photograph was a single word. Vanished. A chill ran down his spine. He looked around, but the square was empty. He slipped the photograph into his pocket and hurried back toward the hut, the storm still beating down. Inside, the villagers were gathered in silence. Haram sat at the center, his head bowed, his hands gripping a string of prayer beads. Ravi stood near the doorway, watching Sundar as he entered, his expression unreadable. Sundar shook the rain from his hair and sat near the edge of the room. For a long time, no one spoke. Then one of the older women finally broke the silence, her voice low but fierce. "You woke it," she hissed, her eyes fixed on Sundar. Sundar frowned. "What do? You mean?" But Haram raised a hand to quiet her. He looked at Sundar, his eyes tired and heavy. "There are things here you don't understand," Haram said slowly. "Things buried for a reason." Sundar reached into his pocket and pulled out the photograph. He held it up. "What happened to them?" he asked. The room fell utterly silent. No one moved. Finally, Ravi spoke. "They were the last outsiders," he said flatly. "What happened to them?" Sundar repeated. Ravi looked him in the eye. And for the first time, Sundar saw something close to fear there. "They tried to dig too deep," Ravi said. No one would say more after that. The storm began to ease as the night wore on, but sleep would not come. Sundar lay awake, staring at the photograph in his hands. The boy in the photo seemed to stare back at him, his eyes full of some terrible knowledge. Sundar kept hearing the words over and over in his head. "You woke it. Don't dig. Go back to your world." But he couldn't. Not now. The next morning the air was thick and humid, the ground still wet from the night storm. The villagers went back to work as usual, though Sundar noticed they avoided the square where the well stood. They glanced at him out of the corners of their eyes, but said nothing. He spent the morning helping Arjun and a few others repair one of the collapsed walls at the edge of the village. As they worked, Arjun looked up at him and asked quietly, "Are you leaving?" Sundar shook his head. "No," he said softly. "Not yet." That afternoon he went back to the well. It was quiet now, the water calm and dark. But as he stood there, he felt a presence behind him. Turning, he saw Haram approaching slowly, leaning on his cane. "You don't belong here," Haram said gently. "Maybe," Sundar replied. "But I can't leave until I understand." Haram sighed. He sat down on the stones of the well and stared into the water. This village, Hiram said, was once full of life. The fields were green, the children laughed, the wells were full, but one year, long before my time, something changed. They dug too deep, found something they should not have. No one speaks of what it was. They just vanished. And well, Sundar asked, IRM single quotes with lips pressed into a thin line. Some say it is cursed. Some say it is a doorway. I don't know. All I know is it has taken many. Sundar glanced down at the water, and if no one digs, Hiram met his gaze, then it sleeps. But as Sundar looked into the old man's eyes, he thought he saw something there, a flicker of guilt, of something unsaid. That night, Sundar couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Every shadow seemed to move. Every gust of wind seemed to whisper his name. When he finally closed his eyes, he dreamed of the well, but in his dream the water was red. And the boy from the photograph stood at the bottom, reaching up toward him, his mouth opening at a silent scream. Woke with a start, sweat soaking his clothes. Outside, the village was quiet. Too quiet. He rose and stepped outside. The moon was thin and pale, the air heavy. He walked to the square and froze. The stones of the well had been disturbed. The earth around it was freshly dug, as though someone had tried to open it. And on the stones lay another bundle, this one larger, wrapped in wet cloth, the edges stained dark. He knelt and unwrapped it. Inside was a rusted spade and another photograph, this time showing only the boy from the first picture, standing alone by the well. His face even more solemn. On the back of this one, written in the same faded ink, were 3 words. He never left. Sundar sat back on his heels, the words echoing in his mind. Thunder rumbled in the distance, though the sky was clear. Then, from the fields beyond the square, came that same eerie wail. Louder this time. Closer. Sundar stood slowly, his eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the huts. The wind picked up, carrying with it the faint smell of earth and iron dot, and for the first time, he thought he saw a figure standing there in the fields, small and thin. Just like the boy in the photographs, Dot raised its hand slowly, pointing toward the well. Sundar single quotes as heart pounded. He took a step back, but then he heard a whisper, so close it seemed to come from inside his own mind. Dig. Asterisk, the wind was sharp and unkind that night, carrying with it the faint smell of something old and metallic, like rusted chains dragged across stone. Sundar stood rooted to the ground, his eyes fixed on the figure in the fields. The small boy, no taller than his shoulder, pointing at the well. For a moment, the entire world seemed to hold its breath. The village behind him was silent, the air heavy with unspoken fear. And in that silence, Sundar could hear only his own heartbeat, fast and uneven. He tried to speak, to call out, but his throat was dry. His voice caught in his chest. The boy's figure shimmered faintly in the moonlight, as though he were made of mist and shadow. Sundar blinked hard, and when his eyes opened again, the figure was gone. Only the empty field remained, dark and whispering with the sound of the wind weaving through the grass. But the voice, the whisper, still lingered in his mind. Dig. He turned back to the well. The stones glistened faintly under the moon, their surfaces slick with dew, and the faintest ripples spread across the water below, though no one had touched it. Sundar stared down into the darkness, his hands resting on the cold stones. He could still feel the weight of the photographs in his pocket, the boy's serious face. The word vanished, the note on the second photo. He never left. He closed his eyes and whispered into the night, almost against his own will. Who are you? But the only answer was the wind, rising and falling like the sigh of something ancient. He stayed by the well until the moon sank low and the stars began to fade. When dawn finally broke, pale and gray, he felt like he had aged years in a single night. The next morning, the villagers moved about their business with an uneasy quiet. Sundar noticed the way they glanced at him now, their suspicion heavier, sharper than before, as though they could sense he had seen something he should not have. Hiram avoided his eyes. Ravi, standing by the edge of the square, simply shook. his head when Sundar approached. "You shouldn't have gone there at night," Ravi muttered. "What is in the well?" Sundar demanded, his voice low but firm. Ravi's jaw tightened. He glanced around to make sure no one was listening, then leaned closer. "Something that does not forgive," he said. Sundar frowned. "Forgive what?" Ravi looked away, unwilling to say more. That day, Sundar tried to lose himself in work, hauling stones, helping repair a broken roof, carrying water from the stream. But wherever he went, the whispers followed him. At one point, as he passed a group of children, he heard one of them murmur under her breath. He woke it. He stopped, turned, but the children scattered like startled birds. By evening, he could no longer bear the weight of questions pressing down on him. He went to Harem's hut and found the old man sitting cross-legged by the small fire. "You know what's in the well?" Sundar said quietly. Harm, single quotes, as hands stilled over his prayer beads. He lifted his eyes slowly, and for the first time, Sundar saw fear there, not of the well, but of the truth itself. "Some things," Harem said softly, "are not meant to be known." "Tell me anyway," Sundar insisted. Harem sighed heavily, as though the weight of years pressed against his chest. He gestured for Sundar to sit. "A long time ago," Harem began, "before I was born, this village was full of love. But there was greed here too. Men came, outsiders, who promised to bring progress, to dig deeper, to uncover water and wealth buried beneath the land. They believed the earth would yield to them if they demanded hard enough." He paused, staring into the flames. "So, they dug," he continued. "They dug beyond the stone, beyond the water, beyond where any man should go. And they found something." Sundar leaned closer. "What did they find?" Harem shook his head. "No one knows. Or if they do, they will not speak of it. All we know is this: the well changed. One by one, the men who dug it began to disappear. First at night, then even in daylight. People said they saw them walking into the fields, into the darkness, following a boy no one else could see. And they never came back. The boy," Sundar murmured. Harem nodded slowly. "He was the first to vanish. They say he was the son of the foreman who ordered the digging, and now he waits. Anyone who comes too close, anyone who wakes him, he calls them to join him." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Sundar stared at the fire for a long time, his mind full of images. The boy's face in the photograph, the hand rising from the water, the voice urging him to dig. Finally he spoke. "Then why not fill the well?" "Seal it?" Harem smiled. Faintly, but it was a sad smile. "We have tried," he said. "But every stone we place is thrown back out by morning. Every rope we cut reappears the next night. The well, it does not let itself be closed." Sundar sat in silence, feeling the chill seep into his bones. Later that night, as the village settled into uneasy sleep, Sundar found himself standing in the square once more, staring at the well. The moon hung low and heavy in the sky, and the air seemed thicker now, full of whispers that slipped past his ears before he could catch them. He knelt by the edge, peering into the black water, and then, softly, clearly, he heard the boy's voice again. "You said you would help us." Sundar froze. "You said you would change?" "Everything." He swallowed hard. "I want to help," he whispered. Then. "Dig." His hand shook as he reached for the rope, lowering the bucket into the darkness. The water below rippled and shimmered, though no wind touched its surface. When he pulled the bucket back up, it was not filled with water, but with a bundle wrapped in the same faded cloth as the photographs. With trembling fingers, he unwrapped it. Inside was another photo, this time a close-up of the boy's face, his eyes dark and endless, his expression almost pleading. Beneath the photo was a small scrap of paper with a single sentence scrawled in the same faded ink. "You're already below." Sundar stared at the words, his breath catching in his throat. The air around him felt colder now, the world quieter. He looked up at the village, but something was wrong. The huts were different, darker. Some half collapsed, others nothing but skeletons of wood and straw. The square itself seemed older, more broken. The stones cracked and covered in moss. He turned toward Harem's hut. But where it had stood was now only an empty patch of earth. His heart pounded as he backed away from the well, his eyes sweeping. The village. Not a single light burned in the windows. Not a single voice rose in the air. The streets were empty, and the fields beyond were a black sea under the moon. And then, at the edge of the square, he saw them. Figures. Dozens of them, standing in silence, their faces pale and blank, their clothes tattered and heavy with earth. And in front of them stood the boy, his small hand raised, pointing at Sundar. You woke us, the boy whispered. Though his lip did not move, the words filled Sundar's mind. The figures began to move forward, their feet soundless on the stones, their eyes fixed on him. Sundar stumbled back, his breath coming fast and shallow. The well behind him gurgled and hissed, and in its depths he thought he could see more hands, more faces, pressing upward against the surface of the water. He closed his eyes, gripping the photograph so tightly the edges cut into his skin. When he opened them again, the boy was right in front of him, so close Sundar could see the faint shimmer of tears in his eyes. Dig, the boy said. Or join us. And before Sundar could answer, the ground beneath his feet gave way. The world tilted. A square vanished. The well swallowed him whole, pulling him down into darkness as cold and heavy as stone. Darkness swallowed Sundar whole, and for a moment he felt nothing. No air, no ground, no sound but the rush of blood in his... It was as if he were suspended in a void, his body weightless, his mind teetering on the edge of panic. Then, slowly, sensation returned. His feet found ground, cold, damp, and uneven, like the floor of some deep cavern. The air here was heavy and wet, each breath filling his lungs with the smell of earth and stone. He opened his eyes and found himself standing in a narrow tunnel, the walls rough and glistening, lined with roots that hung down like dark veins. Behind him, the opening he had fallen through had vanished, leaving only more rock and shadow. He turned in a slow circle, his breath fogging in the cold air. The faintest light, a sickly green glow, pulsed ahead of him, deep in the tunnel, drawing him forward. He could still hear the boy's voice, faint but insistent, somewhere in his mind. Dig. Or join us. Each step echoed softly, though. He felt certain he was not alone. The walls seemed to close in around him the deeper he went. Here and there he thought he heard whispers, but they weren't words so much as sighs, like the last breath of someone long forgotten. After what felt like hours, the tunnel opened into a vast underground chamber. Sundar stopped at the threshold, his eyes wide. The space stretched far beyond the reach of the dim green light, its walls carved with strange, spiraling symbols that seemed to move when he wasn't looking directly at them. Pools of dark water dotted the floor, their surfaces perfectly still, and at the center of it all stood the boy. He was exactly as Sundar remembered from the photographs, small, solemn, barefoot, his clothes tattered, his eyes endless and dark. Around him stood the others, the pale, silent figures who had filled the square above. Their faces were blank now, but something in the way they stood, motionless, waiting, sent a shiver through Sundar's spine. The boy raised a hand and pointed to the ground in front of him. There lay a rusted spade and a patch of earth, darker than the rest. As though it had been freshly turned, Sundar stepped forward slowly, feeling the weight of 1,000 eyes or whatever they were upon him. He picked up the spade. The metal was ice cold in his hands, and the handle was slick with something he didn't want to name. The boy's voice filled the chamber, though his lips never moved. You said you wanted to help. Help us now. Sundar swallowed hard, his knuckles white around the handle. What happens if I dig? He asked softly, though he already feared the answer. The boy's eyes darkened. You set us free. Or you join us forever. The silent figures took a step closer, their feet making no sound on the stone. Sundar knelt on the earth and drove the spade into the ground. The first scoop came up heavy and wet, clinging to the blade. He dug again and again, each strike sending small clouds of dust and cold mist into the air. The whispering grew louder now, circling him, slipping into his ears and under his skin dot as he dug. Strange things began to surface, bones, thin and brittle, tangled. In roots, fragments of faded cloth, small, broken toys. A watch, its hands still and cracked. Each item he unearthed seemed to hum faintly, with some trapped sorrow. But still the boy stood, unmoving, watching Dot. Then the spade struck something solid. Not stone, not bone, but something else. Something that rang softly in the silence of the chamber. Sundar dropped to his knees and began clearing the earth with his hands. His fingers numb and raw. Dot soon he uncovered what looked like a door, a heavy slab of black metal, set into the ground, covered in the same spiraling symbols that writhed and shimmered in the green light. A faint seam ran around its edges, and from that seam a thin mist curled upward like breath. The boy's voice came again, louder now, filling every corner of the chamber. Dot, open it. Now. Sundar hesitated. Every instinct screamed at him to stop, to run, to climb back into the light. But when he looked up, he saw the figures had drawn closer. They were only a few steps away now, their blank faces leaning toward him, their fingers twitching at their sides as though barely holding back. He slipped his fingers into the seam and pulled. Dot. At first, nothing happened. Then, with a groan that seemed to come from the earth itself, the slab began to shift. The mist poured out thicker now, cold and biting. Sundar pushed harder, and the door slid open, revealing a darkness deeper than anything he had ever seen. Dot. From that darkness came a sound, low and mournful, like the cry of 1,000 lost voices rising as one. The boy stepped forward and crouched by the opening. He placed one hand on the edge, then looked up at Sundar with those endless eyes. You woke us. Now finish it. Dot. Without warning, the boy slipped into the hole. Dot. The figures followed silently, one by one, each disappearing into the dark without a sound, until only Sundar remained. He stood there, staring at the open door, the mist curling around his ankles. Then he felt a hand on his shoulder. Dot. He turned, but no one was there. Dot. And the boy's voice was still in his ear. You cannot leave now. Not until it's done. Dot. With shaking hands, Sundar gripped the edge of the opening. He stared into the dark and thought of all the choices that had brought him here. The jet, the emergency landing, the whispers, the photographs. He took a breath, and then he climbed down. The darkness swallowed him again. But this time he felt himself descending, down a narrow stair that spiraled deeper and deeper into the earth. The air here was colder still, and each step seemed to echo with the footsteps of those who had gone before him, after what felt like an eternity. The stair ended in another chamber. This one was smaller, circular, its walls completely covered in carvings that seemed alive in the faint green light. At the center of the floor was a pool of black water, perfectly still, perfectly round. The boy stood on the far side of the pool, waiting. Dot. Finish it. He whispered. Dot. Sundar stepped closer, his reflection rippling in the water. Dot. And then he saw it. Not just his own reflection, but dozens of others behind him, their faces pale and waiting. Dot. The boy crouched and placed his hand into the water. That all of us are here because of what was done. He said, set us free. Sundar knelt by the water's edge, his hands trembling. He didn't know how he knew what to do, only that he had to. He reached into the water. It was icy, but as his fingers touched its surface, the carvings on the walls flared brighter, and the whispers rose to a deafening chorus. The boy closed his eyes and sank completely into the water. Vanishing without a sound, the figures behind Sundar moved forward, closer and closer, until their hands rested on his shoulders, his arms, his back. And the last thing he heard before the water swallowed him too was the boy's voice. Soft and sad. Dot. You're one of those now. Asterisk. The water was endless. It closed over Sundar's head with a silence so complete it felt like the world itself had stopped. There was no up, no down, only the freezing dark pressing in on him from every direction. Yet somehow he could still see faint shapes swimming through the black, their outlines shifting like smoke, their eyes glinting faintly. They circled him slowly, not touching him, but close enough that he could feel the cold of their presence on his skin. He kicked, and struggled, but the water would not release him. He tried to gasp, but no breath came. The black pool was not just water. It was something thicker, heavier, full of memories and voices and despair. As he sank deeper, he saw flashes in the dark, moments that were not his own. Men in dusty, clothes digging into the earth. A young boy standing at the well, pleading silently. The foreman shouting orders. The workers vanishing one by one into the fields at night. Each vision blurred into the next, and then into something worse. The boy, alone at the bottom of the well, weeping, his small fists pounding against the stones as the water rose around him. The voices grew louder now, whispering over one another, overlapping until they were almost a roar. You woke us, you promised to help. You cannot leave, you cannot leave. Sundar felt his body grow colder, heavier, his mind fogging under the weight of their grief and rage. Then, just as he thought he would disappear completely into the darkness, the water brightened, faint at first, then blinding, a light pouring upward from some impossible depth. The shapes around him flinched back, their whispers quieting. To a low murmur, Sundar reached toward the light instinctively, his fingers trembling. It grew warmer as he drew closer, and for the first time since he had fallen below the earth, he felt something like hope. The boy appeared in the light, his small form clearer now, his face no longer solemn but soft, almost human again. He floated in front of Sundar and reached out his hand. Sundar hesitated only a moment before taking it. The light flared, and suddenly they were no longer in the water, but standing at the bottom of the underground chamber. The black pool was gone, replaced by a flat circle of stone, and the walls glowed faintly with green symbols that now seemed calm, almost at peace. Around them, the silent figures stood at the edges of the chamber, watching, but they no longer leaned forward, no longer pressed in on him. Their expressions, if they could even be called that, seemed softer somehow. The boy looked up at him, his dark eyes glinting faintly. You finished it, he whispered. Sundar swallowed, his throat dry. What happens now? The boy tilted his head slightly. Now you see. And he did. He saw the village above them, but not as it was now. He saw it alive, full of color and sound, children laughing, women carrying baskets of grain, men working the fields. He saw it as it had been before the digging began, before greed and arrogance had awakened something they didn't understand. And then he saw the moment it changed, the ground splitting open, the boy tumbling into the depths as the others fled, leaving him behind, leaving him to become part of the darkness below. Sundar closed his eyes against the rush of grief and guilt that was not even his own. When he opened them again, he was alone. The boy was gone. The silent figures were gone. The walls of the chamber faded back to plain stone, and then he felt the ground beneath him shift. With a sound like a deep breath being released, the floor cracked open, and light poured upward, filling the chamber, washing over him, warm and blinding. He stumbled back, shielding his eyes, and when he lowered his hands, he was standing in the square of the village once more, but everything was different. The huts were whole again, their walls bright and clean. Smoke rose from cooking fires. Children ran past him, laughing and shouting. The air smelled of bread and flowers instead of dust and fear. Harim stood nearby, younger somehow, his back straight and strong, smiling faintly as he spoke with a group of men. Arjun ran by, waving at Sundar before darting back to his friends. Even Ravi was there, leaning casually against a tree, his expression softer, almost amused. Sundar looked down at his hands, still expecting to see the mud and blood of the digging. But they were clean now. Warmed out a voice behind him, soft and familiar, made him turn. The boy stood there, whole and alive, wearing a clean shirt and loose trousers. His feet bare, but no longer dirty. His eyes were bright now, free of the endless darkness that had once filled them. He stepped closer and said just one word, thank you. And then just like that, he was gone. The village continued around Sundar as though nothing strange had ever happened. Harim looked up, saw him standing there, and called out cheerfully, come on, don't just stand there. We've got work to do. Sundar glanced back at the well. It was still there, of course, but now the stones glowed faintly in the sunlight, and the water below shimmered clear and blue. He took a breath and walked to the edge dot in its depths. He saw only his own reflection now, and behind him, faint but unmistakable, the boy smiling before fading away completely. He felt a weight lift from his chest. A lightness he hadn't known he carried. Dot, and then, as though on cue, a distant roar split the air above, and Sundar looked up to see his company's jet circling in the sky, descending toward the field just beyond the village. The pilot came running toward him moments later, breathless and relieved. "Sir, are you all right? We've been trying to reach you for days." "The jet is ready. We can leave right away." Sundar looked at him for a long moment, then back at the village, at the people going about their lives. He smiled softly. "Not just yet," he said. The pilot hesitated, clearly confused, but nodded and stepped back. Sundar walked back to the square, where Haram was waiting with a bundle of tools and a faint smile. Arjun waved from where he sat in the shade. Even Ravi gave him a small, grudging nod of respect. Sundar took the spade Haram offered him, feeling its weight in his hands, and for the first time, the whispers were gone. The well was silent. The boy was free, and so was he. Asterisk.